Hi, everyone. My name is Ben Opapari, and this is the Songwriters on Process podcast. Since 2010, I've been interviewing songwriters about their writing process. And on this podcast, we go deep, deep, deep into the writing process. Far deeper than the usual, do you start with the lyrics or the music question? By way of background, I have a PhD in English literature, and I'm a prose writer myself. I'm not a songwriter. In fact, I've never written a song in my life. But my goal has always been to treat songwriters the same way that we treat prose writers and poets, just as writers, plain and simple. And I've always been interested in the writing process. This is an intelligent conversation between two writers. And on this podcast, like I said, we go deep into the process. We talk about rituals, the seeds of inspiration, the role of movement on the process, writer's block, the revision process, pens, pencils, types of paper, and of course, we talk about books. You can find all the archived interviews on the Songwriters on Podcast website and across all streaming platforms. And with that, let's dive into this week's episode. And today on the podcast, we have Conor Deegan, aka Digo, bassist for Fontaines, DC. So a few things first. One, I interviewed Grian Chatton, the singer for Fontaines, back in 2022. Check that out. That's a great podcast as well. I will put the link to that in the description of this podcast, so that'll be down below. Point number two, this is my favorite band out there now. I love everything that they do. I think the music that they're making is like nothing else out there. I will not pretend to be objective. They are my favorite band. I cannot get enough of them. Point number three, run, do not walk to see them live if you get a chance to. I've seen them twice. I saw them for, a couple of years ago. I was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania for work. Saw them in a small club that was maybe 300 people, more like a room. And they were amazing then. Last time I saw them was actually last week. I was in Chicago for work and saw them at the Salt Shed, and they were incredible then too, which reminds me, don't be one of those people that gets to the venue just for the main act. They bring out fantastic support acts with them. The first time I saw them, Wonder Horse opened up, and Jacob is on the podcast too of Wonder Horse. Check that out. And when I saw them last week, it was Ben Stellar opened up for them, and they were great too. So all of those things. Now let's get to the interview. So unfortunately, I stopped the recording before Digo and I started reading poetry to each other. That's the kind of conversation this was. This was as much about writing as it was about the creative mind. Why we write, how we write, the need to create, which is why I think this is really any artist will find, I think, this conversation useful. Certainly not just songwriters. We went deep into the creative mind and kind of that urge to write. We talked about writer's block. We talked about how handwriting is a window into the soul. Why songwriting or writing involves suffering. I'm not talking about the tortured artist, but you'll see what I mean when we talk about that. We obviously went deep into literary influences, Hemingway, Fitzgerald, many of them. We talked about that too. And also, I'm hearing this a lot too. How bad phones and social media can be for creativity. How if you're looking at your phone the whole time, you're not taking in what's around you. Their new album is called Romance. It came out in April. It's fantastic. I feel like I'm using all these superlatives, but I just can't say enough about this band. One more thing, I'm not giving anything away here. They closed with Starburster when I saw them, and oh my God, what an incredible song live to see. I was wondering when they were going to play it, and when they played it last, I thought that's why. So anyway, this is I've done 400 or so interviews for this site. This one and with Grian were probably two of my favorites. So this is a deep discussion about not just about the particulars, the logistics of the process, more about creativity as a whole. So I hope you enjoy, again, their latest album, Fontaines DC's latest album. Romance is out now. Check it out. Here is my interview with Deegan of Fontaines DC. One of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to read some quotes from writers to
Yeah.
you and see how you react to them. Like, I love to talk about writing, but also I think, writers are writers, plain and simple. So um, I've got this quote by Maya Angelou up here, and she said, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." And I'd love to know, like, how often you get the urge, like the drive to write, not, oh, I should be writing today, but just the drive, the urge to create in some fashion, like as a writer.
Yeah, like that's an interesting quote. I think that that's something that probably Green feels more. He definitely has that sense of like, I need to get this off my chest as a writer. And I think that's really can be felt in the kind of urgency that he writes with a lot. Um, but like, but personally, I really like that quote as well. I don't know if we're just going to start exchanging quotes now, right? Okay.
Let's do it.
I recently got into this quote by Leonard Cohen, which is saying like, writing isn't something that you make or whatever. So writing is the ashes of a life burnt, and you have to go out and live like, burn your life really well, um, and then you'll have some ashes to show for it. And it's really good because it shows that songs are a consequence of living, right? That there's a life experiences we have, and without them, we can't have any songs. And so I think that while someone like Green or Maya Angelou might say, this song is sitting in my heart, and I need to express it, or I'm going to be in a lot of pain. Um, I think that it isn't so much divine intervention, or it isn't like this momentary thing. I think that like the more you have to have enough stuff there going on to burn, you have to have had these life experiences that you somehow correlate with each other, and then there's this moment where they can, there's enough tinder there for it all to spark up into a flame.
So when you start to write, then is it because there's a collection of experiences, or is it because there's one thing that happens and you think, I've got to write about this?
I think that there's, different people have their different way of writing, but for me at least, I think that if I just wrote exactly about what had happened, then it would be too boring or cliche. I think it has to be combined in some way. It's more interesting to find how you can correlate two or more stories together, or more things together, and find some kind of metaphor or analogy that makes them work at the same time. Or you can just add a bit of depth, I think, to your understanding as well of a subject, and make it more unique or something. I guess that there's some kind of fear there of like the bravery of just being plain spoken as well. I think that some people can do that. I think that Lou Reed was all about that, but I don't think we're like that. Maybe it's because we're too Irish.
Well, I do remember Green saying, and not to make this about him, but he couldn't imagine not writing. Like, that's like he felt like he had to write. It wasn't even a question of wanting to write, is that he had to.
Yeah.
And I remember that being a recurring theme of that. So are you okay then with going stretches without writing? That doesn't make you anxious or anything like that?
Absolutely. I absolutely hate doing stretches without writing.
Oh, you
I,
do? Okay.
I hate it. It does make me feel very uncomfortable. But I just have a certain belief now that I'm trying to foster within myself. I'm trying to make myself believe this quote, even if it doesn't feel right, because it gives me some time to bring some stuff together. And I know that's how it works for me anyway. And then I'll have something that's I can be really proud of.
So how do you, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah. I was just going to say, like, the need to write is an interesting thing, because I think that it can be most like people can fancy writing. They could have an enjoyment of writing, but there's that need to write that is actually you know you have the need for it if it actually causes you suffering, like, and you don't do
So yeah, so with that suffering, then is that suffering that's good or bad then?
it. I don't know. I mean, I hope I'm not trying. I hope I'm not sounding too convoluted now.
No.
But I'm just exploring this as we speak, you know. But I think that it can be good and it can be bad. I think that the there's suffering that comes from not being able to write or having any kind of creative blocks that is just part of the process, but yeah, just not great. And then there's like the pain of actually being honest and trying to push yourself with your honesty or with what you're willing to write about, um which can be difficult, like to actually talk about, um because it's easy to like speak about something like your childhood in very vague terms, right? But no one's gonna fucking give a shit if you just write in really vague terms. But if you can say it in some write down honestly how you feel, and that the courage of that honesty actually means that you most of the time get something unique, and then you can move from there. You can move from there, and there's a suffering in that, I suppose.
Okay, so this is fascinating to me. The idea of kind of collective gathering of experiences rather than like writing in the immediacy of something. So, how can I put this? Do you have that theme first and then you wait for events that kind of fit that theme, or do you collect those experiences and then say, "Oh, here's the through line"?
um I think that stuff like it's informed by each other. Like I was writing a song like a while ago, and I had just moved to Paris, and I was living um above a laundrette, where you wash your clothes.
Yeah.
And I was like trying to get into some new kind of reading that I hadn't read before. And I was reading this book on Taoism. And it's like a Chinese philosophy about like kind of, I mean, it's going to sound really reductive now, but like kind of going with the flow. you know, I really wish that like Lao Tzu in ancient China had just met like a Californian surfer bro. It would have saved him a lot of ink. But no, but yeah, going with the flow kind of, and I don't know, like the struggle of life and how to move away from that. And that kind of thinking was on my mind, and I was walking the streets and stuff, and I was writing, and I sat down to write, and I was, I had some lyrics about this kind of thing. I was also thinking about trying to apply it to my own life, and then I couldn't think of a chorus, and then just the name of where I was showed up on my phone on the memos app. Do you know? So it
Yeah.
showed up the name of this laundrette underneath me, and I just said the name of the laundrette, which was like Saint Hyang, and then that actually I found out. I was like, Saint Hyang, what the fuck is that? It sounded really nice as a chorus sign, but I was like, what the hell is that? And I looked it up, and it was like French and Chinese, and it translated as healthy riverbed. And I was writing the song about about going with the flow, about the river, blah blah blah, like but also the idea of the water bringing up to the earth and like leaving the earth flatter and stuff like this. And I was like, Jesus, this really works. Somehow this all came together. How did this all come together like this? But it's not just about like, of course there's some aspect of like divinity or something, but it's not just about divinity, because it's about that like being open to perceiving these things and bringing these things together. It was a coincidence in some way that I was above a laundrette. But the fact that I noticed it wasn't a coincidence. That was me. Like the fact that I noticed it was related to the topic wasn't a coincidence.
That's almost too coincidental. I feel like if that happens, you almost have to write about it.
Yeah, I suppose. But I think that like there is like a mental muscle that's being used there, and that's something that we either neglect or like we work on. And that muscle is something that most writers, like the really good writers, are very good at, and it's why they can write a lot, is because they're very perceptive, and they can find ways of correlating all of these things together. They can look around and see so many correlations and plus them together into their own feelings. But I think that that leads to a lot of people getting very sick, you know, mentally. Like, I think that's
Yeah.
why, because you kind of start to buy into your, um, like the reality, your emotional reality, it starts to become more tangible in some way and more powerful. And then you can be sucked into it a lot. And then with success as well, people can kind of be told, you know, be let believe their fantasies more and more because it's what they make their book off, and other people around them make books off that. And so, um, yeah, so it can lead to people down pretty sad places. I think sometimes. I think that's, you know, why people, you know, often don't call out the suffering artist. Like, you know, they don't call them out and say, "Hey, man, you need to get some help."
Yeah. Well, okay, so that's actually a good lead into what I was going to ask you anyway, and that is, can you write from emotional extremes? There's some songwriters that tell me that if they're too sad, they can't write, or if they're too euphoric, they can't write, and they need distance from that emotion. So, can you write from those extremes, or is that a place where you just say, I've got to shut down, I can't write at this time?
Sometimes I can, sometimes I can. I have been able to write from a sense of euphoria once or twice. But I think that mostly I go to a melancholy place, to be fair. But I think that that's something that I just am most comfortable with. I think that's like a spirit I can embody and feel quite natural in it. Um, I think that like other kind of spirits I can try, like other moods I might get into. I could start playing, but and writing, but I could feel like this isn't very me. This is a mask of some kind, and the ability to kind of hold that mask up and actually do it can be quite tricky. I was actually having a conversation with Green about this, and he was like, one of the useful tools for him for pushing the boundaries is humor. So he'll use humor as a self defense mechanism against himself to write in a new genre or a new style, because he can go in and he can just say to himself, right, I'm going to do a country song right now with a mad fucking banjo or something. But I'm only taking the piss, you know, I'm only messing around and it's a joke. And it's starting that spirit, but actually try and do it really well. And I've done that before myself. And that was like, I've actually written like that, and songs I'll never show anyone, but like very fun explorations of like, you know, trying to do a 60s French thing or something like Lee Hazelwood or whatever. And just absolutely having a laugh to myself, you know.
But that's a pretty, I feel like that's a good way to lessen the anxiety around the process. I mean, I'm a writer too, and I find that the more I think about writing with a capital W, the harder it is to write because you're putting so much pressure on yourself. So I find the simple act of writing in an unconventional place, maybe a new chair, someplace I haven't been. And songwriters will tell me that they'll write lyrics on the back of envelopes, or because rather than the fancy journal, write it on a scrap piece of paper, and that lessens the anxiety. I get the sense a little bit if that's what you're talking. Maybe that, like, that new genre
Yeah.
lessens the anxiety, maybe.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean, but it's not so much it's the it's not the genre, it's the attitude of humor towards the genre that you're uncomfortable with. Like so you can begin in that genre, you know. And it lets you settle in and let your guard down, because there's the voices that trigger up that go, this isn't any good. What the hell are you doing? Like making a bad country song. But then you can just use humor to kind of get into it more, and then you relax. And I think you like you zoned in on something good with the relation to the scraps of paper, because there is something for some people with the moleskin journal, and they think that it's off-putting. But personally, I actually do like them. I I like a journal, and I think it's something I can take with me anywhere because it fits in my pocket, and it also gets me off my phone, which I think phones are terrible for the concentration and for creativity, to be honest. Um, or for the solitude of the mind, it's a really, really bad thing because if you're just alone for any second of the day now, you just pick up your phone and look at something and you're not inside yourself at all. And with a notebook or some, you can get into some routine of going to a cafe or even just when you're waiting for the bus, just write a little diary entry and it starts this process of introversion, which is being neglected a lot by people these days, It really, really is.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I interviewed Robin Hitchcock several years ago, and he talked about how absolutely phones have ruined, not well, ruined, have really affected his creativity. And he said it's just kind of what you said, the mere because if I'm looking at my phone, I'm not engaging with the world around me.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so when you write, then are you? Do you like to write? Do you prefer? I'm getting the sense you prefer pen and paper. If you're writing things, do you prefer pen and paper rather than a phone, or are you more of a computer or tech person?
I use a pencil and paper.
Okay, so this is we could talk for hours about. I mean, you probably wouldn't be surprised, but songwriters are incredibly divisive on this issue. So there's first of all, there's the pens and the brands of pen and the color of ink, but you're
Yeah.
talking about, I mean, I could do a whole topic on that alone
Um,
about the brand of the pen or the color. But
yeah.
then here's the thing with pencils, and I hear it both ways. So the advantage of the pencil is that if you don't like something you've written, you can cross it out, but it's always there in case you need it again. Um, but then there's some people that use the eraser because they don't want to see what they've written. So anyway, I'd love to know your rationale for the pencil. Maybe it's not as deep as that, but what is it?
I don't know. I think that there's like a permanence to the pen, and I think that I wanted to have something that didn't feel as permanent, that felt less pressure to commit to it because I was doing a lot of diary stuff for like last year. I was trying to commit to writing a diary entry every day, and I filled up a couple of journals with diary entries. To be fair, and writing with pencil on lined paper made my handwriting way fucking better. It really did. It like came on to the best it had been probably since I was in school. And I think that did something for my self view as well, to have something like connected with a very, very old version of myself. Because even in secondary school, I don't know, you probably call it high school, you use pen the entire time. And pencil is something from when you were a kid. And there's some kind of, it's probably a bit like taking joking around in country music, right? It's some kind of layer, or writing on a scrap of paper. It's some level of protection. It's some level of if I don't think it's good, I can rub it out. It's not like I'm committing this to this idea of being this pretentious person with a notebook, so I can just rub it out. But I don't know. I do like the pencil and the paper. I think that when I'm editing though, if I get into it if I really am starting to settle on a lyric, and I'm editing it, I start to get into some phase of editing a lot, just tiny bits of words or the order. I'll just start using like the notes app on my phone because it saves a fucking hassle. It's very quick, like.
It's funny, songwriters can be it's almost like we reached a point where the tech has gotten so advanced that people are regressing. I've had songwriters tell me that they do all of their lyrics in email and they just email themselves all the revisions. So they always have, they see they see 20 emails to themselves and they see those earlier versions of the lyrics.
Yeah.
Which is something people did before the cloud. That was hilarious. It was like that's what people did 20 years ago when you didn't have the cloud. Now we're back to that. But um, so you said something interesting that again I've never thought of before, and that is that when I write, and I have horrible handwriting. So if I'm writing on a paper, there's a version of me on that paper. I can see in my handwriting my soul,
Yeah.
like my But if I type something, hell, that could just as easily be you. Like it's the anonymity of the font that. But when when I write, I can see myself. I can see almost my handwriting when I was a kid, and that's so interesting. I never thought of it that way, but that's pretty deep. I mean, the idea that when we're writing, we can see a version of ourselves on the page that we don't see when we're typing, right?
Totally, like absolutely. And there's so much to that. I think that when I used to write before with the pen and my handwriting was much shakier, I was seeing myself as like, this is someone who's self-serious, but also unsure of themselves because their hand, it's a bit shakier. And somehow giving up that self-seriousness of the pen and just letting myself be a beginner with the pencil and letting my handwriting get better and better over time was much more beneficial to me. And also, as you say, like you can see your character. I can see like uh whatever mood I'm in, depending on how I might write faster, I might write slower, might write more carefully, or start making loads of spelling mistakes depending on the mood I'm in. And also I might see stuff like an A. I might think about my ex-girlfriend, and use an A that she used to write, like, someone I was with for years, and her handwriting, she had a particular A, and sometimes I'll use that A or stuff, and you can like break this down in some way. Obviously, I'm not like, what's the word for the person who's like analyzes handwriting, you
Oh
know?
boy, I'll find it. Well, I don't know what is the. Yes, I know there is a term for that person. Yeah.
Yeah, that person. I'm not trying to say like I'm that kind of person, but I just think that, as you say, you can see a lot of someone's life in their handwriting. And when you go onto the notes app or email or whatever, you get no sense of that whatsoever.
And also, if you're looking back at those journals that you wrote, you can, I think what you're saying is that if you go back to any of those days, you can put yourself back in that day by seeing yourself on the page. And almost you can see where you were at that moment by going back to those, right?
Yeah, totally.
So,
It's something I don't revisit now at the moment, to be fair, those notebooks. I'd like to leave them. I think there's a period of time that's like too close to home, like 6 months or a year. You have to leave it like 5 years before you come back to the notebook, maybe.
okay, so that's a good segue into my next question. I feel like this is all these segues. I've got two quotes up here. So, and you mentioned Paris.
Yeah.
Hemingway famously said he could never write about Paris when he was in Paris. He had to have distance from Paris to be able to write about it. That was Hemingway. Now, William Burroughs said there is only one thing a writer can write about: what is in front of his senses at the moment of writing. So we have two opposite ideas there. One is that distance isn't good. The other one is that you need distance. So, um, how do you feel about that? Can you write about something in the immediacy, or do you need distance from it?
Um, I think it really depends, I think how much you're, how much you're capable of as a writer, um, is basically the answer to that question. If something's like, sometimes something's so close to happening that you don't understand it. Like if you have a breakup or something and it's just happened and it's really fresh, I think that it can be a very furtive time for writing songs, right? But oftentimes the songs will be cliche. Everyone feels basically the same feelings, at
Yeah.
that moment of a breakup. However, on reflection, and if you're examining what really happened there based on that person's character since they were like a kid, or what happened to them when they were a teenager, or and their relationship with you and your dynamic based on your own life and experiences and the flaws that you might have had as people, and how those interacted with each other and how things were good in some ways, and you can like pick this apart and see what did it mean in personal character growth and blah blah blah. It's far more interesting, I think, and it's far more rich. But it takes a little bit of time to be able to look at it honestly, because obviously, like personally, I'd be very emotionally invested in my relationships, and I kind of get a bit like, I'd be upset or something afterwards, and it would cloud my judgment to be able to look at it in some kind of look at myself at least in an objective way, and then I can see, oh, how did this actually happen? But what I'm trying to say is that, like, you know, um, when am I in it and when am I not in it? When am I out of that? Is there ever a stage where I'm out of that, or you know, it's hard to say. Like, I think that we have these experiences and they stay with us in a large degree. We can have more perspective on them, sure, but I think that, like, it's down to the capability of the writer as well. There's probably a certain level of distance and closeness that I'm personally comfortable with. There's probably some kind of layer of analysis that makes me feel safer in some way, right? But that's just me as an individual. And then, like, as Hemingway might say, "Oh, you can't write about it if you're in it." I don't know about that. For him, maybe that's true, but I've definitely read A Movable Feast, and he's completely in it. You know, even if he's like, "Oh, I wrote that when I was sitting in uh, Ketchum, Idaho." You know, I don't believe that he was in Ketchum, Idaho when he wrote it in his mind. No, he was definitely
Yeah. It's funny about Hemingway, and we'll talk about writing later, but how his style, there was a great book, and the name escapes me, but it was called Everyone Behaves Badly. I think that's what it was called. I think that's what it's called. Anyway,
okay.
it's about the whole writing process behind Sun Also Rises,
Right.
um, and how basically after the book was published and people realized that every character in the book was after someone in his actual life, no one ever talked to him again, any of those people, because the names were changed, but everyone recognized someone in that book. But
Yeah.
my point here is that what people don't realize is that when he sat down to write that book, like, he was friends with Fitzgerald, but he hated Fitzgerald's writing. He hated the style, and 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 he deliberately said, "I'm gonna write in a style that no one has ever done before." It's not like, "Oh, I wrote this thing and I happen to write about this thing, or I happen to write this thing, and wow, that looks different." It was, "I hate everything up to this point. I'm gonna write in a style that no one has ever seen." And so the
Yeah.
deliberateness of that was incredible.
I think that, look, if we can be real, right, from personal experience as well, I can tell you that is a very resentful, resentful opinion of Hemingway,
Wait, what do you mean?
of F. Scott Fitzgerald's work.
Oh yeah,
Yeah, that is like class A alcoholic resentment shit. Like,
yeah.
oh yeah, wounded ego, but I'm going to take you down to put myself up. Shit, and it has, yeah, I can see that a million miles away. Writing about everyone in his life and analyzing them and saying why they're good and bad as well. I mean, is that being a writer? Is that being a bit of an alcoholic? Or is there a point in delineating that for him? Like, that's who he is, right? Um, I don't know. What was the rest of what you were saying?
No, that was just my point, was that it was just on his style in general, was that it was interesting how he was so, he deliberately set out to write that way. But okay, so let me shift gears, and I've got another quote, and this is from Agatha Christie. And Agatha Christie said, "The best time to write a book is when you're doing the dishes." So I always love to have this conversation with songwriters about and there was an article in the Washington Post a couple of years ago about why we get our best ideas in the shower. And the number of times songwriters tell me they get ideas while they are vacuuming, folding laundry, doing the dishes, gardening,
Yeah,
that our creative ideas come to us when our brains are engaged in an activity that requires no conscious thought. I mean, David Byrne said, "A car is a good place to write lyrics. Driving occupies one part of the brain, freeing up the other."
yeah,
So I know for me, those eureka moments happen when I'm not thinking about those eureka moments. So I'd love to explore how often that happens to you when you get ideas during those times when your brains are engaged in those kinds of activities.
yeah. I love that. I think that I love cycling for that. I cycle around London and it clears the head, and I listen to music or I think about things. And It's a good one. And exercise is good as well. Um, there was another one I was thinking of there. Kind of when you're waking up in the morning or just falling asleep is really, really good. Um, because it also brings in another aspect, right? So what you're talking about is like, doing physical movement of any kind. It frees up a certain kind of anxiety or absoluteness to the thought, to the and because you're engaged in some other activity, your mind can wander in some kind of way that is less intense. And I think that lack of intensity kind of is in a similar vein to this, humor thing we were talking about before in the past, or anything we've spoken about so far, I suppose. In that it frees up, because I think, right. And sorry, I never asked you actually, what kind of stuff do you write yourself?
Well, so my PhD is in well, actually, since you asked me, I did write a book this summer that's a rock memoir. A good friend of mine, I have it here actually. He's
Yeah.
a guitarist in Lamb of God, the metal band Lamb of
Oh
God.
yeah. Uh,
So Mark's a good friend of mine. So we
Okay.
co-wrote his memoir. Um, so my PhD is in 20th century American theater, so playwrights.
Okay.
Like Tennessee Williams, Sam Shepard, Eugene O'Neill. Those are some of the posters actually behind me.
Yeah.
So yeah, so the writing I do, I'm in the corporate world now, but that's the kind of writing that, with the book and stuff like that. So kind of all over the place.
All right. Cool. Um, you've written some fiction ever?
Never. That like I have incredible respect for people who can write fiction. Um, I can't do that. And
Oh,
I've never like my PhD is in 20th century American theater, so playwrights, but I couldn't imagine writing a play. It's funny. I could never imagine doing that.
wow. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll ask you the question I was going to ask you anyway, and see if you can relate to it. All right, because
Yeah.
of just where this conversation is going. So I think that in terms of this like idea of the exercise or driving or doing the laundry, right? It kind of relates to when you first start writing, when you very, very first start writing, and the innocence of that and the connection with the form and the exploration of the form in a very fresh and childlike way. And you don't even need to be a child, you just need to be at that stage of your creativity. And there's no limitations, but there's also no like what's the word, checks and balances of taste and what like avoiding cliche or everything that you do know that later on informs what you're capable of, but also is the inner critic, right? And it's stopping you from, on a very simple level, it's great because it stops you from writing something that's already been written, because you go in your mind, no, that's that fucking song by Wilco, okay, all right, whatever. And then but also it can be the thing that stops you from really freeing yourself. And that's why I think a lot of people lose their creativity as they get older as well. Um, because there's a balance between, knowledge and lack of knowledge. Like lack of knowledge is also an important aspect of songwriting, because, you have to free yourself and be okay with that. And I think that, when we're younger, at least for me, it was very easy for me to write songs on some level. I could write fucking 10 songs a week, because I was just like, I could, as you say, write down anything exactly as it happened. And I was just putting the same chords for Wonderwall underneath it or whatever. And I was saying, this is my song, check it out. And then, because I was fucking at a kid or whatever, my parents would be like, that's cool. But if I did that now, people would be like, man, why are you ripping off the chords for Wonderwall, first of all? And why the fuck are you writing about, a train set? That's not very interesting. But like, but when we're driving around or something, this skepticism, we're not capable of having this skepticism while we're doing the laundry, right? There's something freed up, I think, and we can kind of be creative in that more innocent way. And I think it's very worthwhile. Yeah, it's very important to have those moments, and to try and foster that aspect of ourselves. Yeah, like to actually nurture it. I mean, sorry, nurture it.
Okay, so ready for this quote? This is from E.L. Doctorow, the novelist, and he said, writing is, and songwriters love this quote, by the way, this is their favorite. Writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. I'll repeat that. Writing is like driving at night in the fog. You can only see as far as the headlights, but you can make the whole trip that way. So
Mm,
before you respond to that, I will say this. I don't think as a writer, I have any right knowing what it's supposed to look like when I start. And
yeah,
that to me is the like, I don't know if it's a psychic thing or a spiritual thing, but I don't think I've any right when I sit down knowing, oh, that's what it's supposed to look like. I don't
yeah.
have any right knowing that.
I think you've really clocked onto something that a lot of people miss with that, and it's a really, really important part of writing. And I love that quote because it really illustrates that well. And I think that some people, and I'm guilty of it in myself in the past, right? But I've never really succeeded at it. Luckily, look, where it's like I haven't done this. This is an example, but someone might say, "I'm going to sit down and write a song that details like Marie Antoinette." You know, I'm going to show the French Revolution from a different perspective, and it's like, man, you're not going to do that. Like, you're not going to. You could potentially do it, but it probably will suck. But if you sit down and you're writing a song and you're feeling things and you're exploring something and you cotton on to her as a character and you feel something for her, you know, and you start to use her and explore her life in that way, and then suddenly you can relate in some way to the French Revolution. And as you say, it's like these headlights in the fog. You're just like, dealing with what's exactly in front of you instead of dealing with the entire situation at once, because the weight of that is way too much and you're never going to be able to do it. And it's why I kind of in some way think that tension between your quote from Hemingway and the other writer, I can't remember his
Burroughs,
name,
yeah. William Burroughs.
Burroughs, yeah, is interesting. Are you in it? Is it easier when you're in it? Is it or when you're away from it, or which one's possible? And I think that is a tension that we walk, and we need to keep ourselves, we're on the road, we're driving, we have the headlights on, we're aware that we need to do something, right? And we're going to walk and, drive in some direction. But um, I don't think it would be beneficial to know that, like, maybe the road is on the edge of a sheer cliff the entire time and we couldn't see that. You drive the roads in front of you, you're like, okay, I can do this safely. But if you knew the cliff was there.
And if you listen to any novelist, like no novelist I've ever read says, "Oh, when I started writing this book, I knew what the characters were supposed to do." Every novelist says they just start writing and they want to see where the characters take them.
Yeah.
It's such a basic element of fiction writing that novelists say that, it's always that idea of, yeah, I wanted to write that and I wanted to see where they would take me. Um, so I wanted to tell you this because we talk about physical activity. So, and there's a reason why we're creative in physical activity. So I wrote an article, I do some freelance writing for the Washington Post, and I'm a runner too. And there's a very clear link between aerobic exercise and creativity. So I'll tell you why it happens. And there's a scientific reason. It's been replicated in the lab. So there's a chemical in the brain called brain-derived neurotrophic factor that gets secreted through increased blood flow, which is exercise. So what they did in the lab was they put people on a treadmill for 20 minutes
Okay.
at 60% max heart rate, which is not much more than a moderate walk. And then afterwards, administered a battery of tests to them measuring executive function, creativity. Those
Yeah.
people always scored higher than people that didn't exercise. And the benefit lasts about 90 minutes post exercise. So the parameters are 30 minutes at 60% max heart rate. Again, 60% is not much more than a moderate walk. And the good news is it's not what they call dose responsive. So 60 minutes isn't twice as good as 30 minutes, and 90% heart rate isn't better than 60%. So there's all this research behind why when we exercise, when we're done, we're flooded with creativity. Now, the only caveat is that
Yeah.
ideally it needs to be an exercise that doesn't involve executive function or like higher order thinking. So if you're like walking in an urban environment, that's not as effective as the woods because you're trying not to get hit by a car.
Yeah.
So there's actually scientific research behind why when we exercise, we're creative. And since we're talking about literature, there's a great book called The Friendship, um, that's about the friendship between Wordsworth and Coleridge. And they estimate Wordsworth walked 100,000 miles in his lifetime. And Wordsworth would create almost all of his poems on walks. And
Yeah.
Wordsworth preferred a flat terrain, Coleridge preferred a rocky terrain. But Wordsworth would create and he would edit and revise these poems in his mind and wouldn't come home until they were fully formed.
Legend.
I mean,
Yeah.
um, but anyway, so that's why that there's a reason for why when we exercise, we're flooded with creativity. So when you're cycling, there's a reason for that.
That's really great to know that yeah, I mean it's great to know the mechanic of that. I feel like we knew that already, you know. We felt it all. We all felt it, but it's nice to know that there's confirmation of that kind of mechanism.
Yeah. All right. So last question, because I could sit here all day and I'm sure you're busy. So what genres do you tend to gravitate towards when it comes to reading? Does the genre matter? Are you a genre person? Are you an author person? It's
I recently I've been reading horror mangas, to be honest, which is a bit random, but I find something fascinating about them. Junji Ito, who's cool. And then other than that, I kind of really like American writers, who write about like mid 20th century stuff, like Raymond Carver, John Williams, and yeah, I was also reading some Japanese stuff for a while. What's that guy's name? Uh, but basically, yeah, anything that's kind of has a character that I can really get into, or I will go into poets individually at a time and get into the poets and have a little vibe with them and see what they're like. Who was I reading? I got a copy of Baudelaire, Charles Baudelaire.
oh, nice.
Yeah, and I got it because my French is pretty decent these days, you know, since I lived in Paris for a while. I got a copy of his poetry in French on one side and English on the other, you know. So it's nice to read through and note the differences between the translations, I suppose, to the best of my ability. But it's lovely. It's lovely to be able to do that, to be fair.
I got a recommendation for you then. So since you talk about that mid-century, it's a little later than mid-century, but I was turned on to this writer by a lot of songwriters, and
Yeah.
his name is Brees DJ Pancake. Okay.
What the hell? What do you
So
say?
okay, you write this down. So, or I'll put it in the chat after when we stop recording.
Oh my God. I was like, is this guy okay? Like, I was like thinking, are you okay right now?
Yeah, Brees, Breece, then D apostrophe J Pancake. Okay, so here's the backstory. And he multiple. I was turned on to him by songwriters. So they call him the Hillbilly Hemingway because he's from the Appalachia, West Virginia, I think.
Yeah.
And he wrote one book of short stories, and he was kind of seen to be the next great American fiction writer. Wrote one book of short stories in the 1980s, and he committed suicide when he was like 25. So he's written one book, and it's a book of short stories, and but it's that Hemingway-esque style, but it takes place in the mountains, and that's kind of a neglected, area as far as genres and locations. Not so much anymore, but unbelievable. One book, and that was it. And I think people are hoping they're going to dig up more writing from him, somewhere. But
Ah, that sounds
uh,
great.
yeah. Um,
You know, what is it? Have you read other books by John Williams other than Stoner?
I don't think I have. No.
Yeah, I would love to. I'd love to give it a shot. I wonder, is he like? I mean, I don't want to talk badly about him, but can he did he pull it off again? Because that book is one of the best books of all time, in my opinion. Stoner, like.
Yeah,
I
and he
wonder if he.
comes up. I mean, Raymond Carver comes up a lot. To the most common ones from songwriters are Raymond Carver,
Yeah,
uh, Kurt Vonnegut.
Kurt Vonnegut.
Um, you got Cormac McCarthy, of course. It's kind of the ones that have the economy of language. I mean, it's not a surprise, right? Um,
Yeah,
and then
I love that.
Bukowski, not as much anymore, but it's kind of those. But Brees DJ Pancake, I mean, there was an article about him in the New Yorker magazine a few years ago about his whole backstory, and it's incredible because he really was considered to be the next great writer. And the writing's incredible, but he, again, it's a lot of songwriters told me about him, and that's how I found out about him. And that's it for today's episode. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget my book, Desolation, a heavy metal memoir by Mark Morton with Benno Papari, that is me, comes out June 25th on Hachette Books. Mark is a good friend of mine. He is one of the guitarists in the band Lamb of God, and this is his memoir. It's a damn good book, if I do say so myself. But again, that book is out June 25th on Hachette Books. You can pre-order it now everywhere, your favorite online bookstore. So be sure to do that. The site, Songwriters on Podcast, contains all of the archived episodes of the podcast. Of course, you can find them on all streaming platforms as well, but they're also on the site. I only have had the podcast for about I don't think even 2 years. Before that, all of the interviews were transcribed, and that took a lot of work. And that's why I started the podcast. So if you want to read the interviews that I did before the podcast, they are on Songwriters on Podcast as well. There are about 200 of them going back to 2010. So check those out. If you want to get a hold of me, Ben at songwritersonprocess.com, or fill out a form on the website. I'm here for your questions, your complaints, your concerns, or your interview suggestions. I'd love getting those as well. So hit me up. I will try to respond. So that's it, everyone. Have a great day and see you next time.